All right, I think we're going. All right, welcome to the very first episode of my new channel, Pipes with Augustine. If you don't know me yet, my name is Chris Jasper. If you do know me, you probably know me from my other channel, Gregorian Chant Academy, which is dedicated to, of course, Gregorian chant and sacred music. This is my new channel, which is a channel dedicated to Catholic topics other than sacred music. And yes, the name is a play on Matt Fradd's Pints with Aquinas, but no, I'm not trying to copy him. He is probably my favorite Catholic podcaster, so Matt, if you're watching this, cheers, mate. Today is the first episode on this new channel, and I'm joined today interviewing my dad, William F. Jasper, on the topic of the history of communism. Our next episode will be with our good friend and exorcist, Father Chad Ripperger, on the philosophical and theological issues surrounding AI, artificial intelligence. Speaking of Father Ripperger, he also, in the topic of communism, if you go on his channel, Sensus Traditionis, he has a big, long series of videos on the topic of the similarities between the psychology of communists and the psychology of demons, which is very interesting. So I might recommend that as well. Before we get any further, though, I do want to say, if you are watching this on YouTube, of course, I greatly appreciate if you subscribe here on the YouTube platform, but also I would please recommend to you to subscribe also on Spiritus TV, which is the Catholic alternative to YouTube, because a video like this, YouTube is so censorial that a video like this they could easily censor, or perhaps even censor the whole channel. So please go over and also subscribe on Spiritus TV, the Catholic alternative to YouTube. With that, I think we can go ahead and introduce you. So, thanks, Dad, for coming on the show and making the big, long trip from your upstairs office to my downstairs office, and for bringing your microphone.
And congratulations on your new program, your new podcast. I'm honored to be your first guest.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I hope your legs aren't too tired from the long trip downstairs.
No, well, I had to make several,
Yeah. I know you're kind of old, but I think you're still in good enough condition. So anyway, for those guests of ours who don't know who you are you? What do you do, and why are you qualified to speak on this topic?
I am your dad.
Oh, well, I guess that's enough.
I'm senior editor of the New American magazine.
And a senior.
Yes, and have been since the founding of the New American 37 years ago. And before that, was a contributing editor to American Opinion magazine and the Review of the News magazines, which were predecessors of the New American, which were then combined and to produce the New American magazine. And I'm sure you're going to show copies of it and give promotion of it in the magazine, thenewamerican.com. So
you said senior editor of the New American magazine, which previously was known under a different title of American Opinion, and you weren't called senior editor of that, but a contributing editor. So when did that switch from American Opinion to New American?
Here you're going to get me in trouble with my colleagues. 1983.
Oh, 83. Oh, okay.
83 and 84 is when we were making it.
So when did you first start writing?
1979.
79, wow.
Before you were born.
Yeah, before I was born. You've also written 2 books.
Yes, I was for many years, for over 3 decades, our accredited correspondent at the United Nations in New York. Accredited meaning they actually gave me accreditation to go in there. I was the only conservative Americanist type editor, writer there at the New American. Virtually everybody else from all the news services, the networks and everything were your typical liberal, so liberal left folks who were cheering on the United Nations, cheering on the internationalism So yes, I did that for many years, and that's one of the areas which I think contributed to my knowledge base about communism and socialism. The United Nations is completely dominated by communist and socialist countries and organizations, like the Socialist International, which is an official partner with the United Nations, and with the World Economic Forum, which is all the big globalist billionaires who have an official partnership with the United Nations. So anyway, so I did that for many years. It's been a few years since I've been back to the UN. We now have other people who cover that. I don't have to go back to that hellhole. And so I let others do that. I do my work from here. But a little bit more about my background. I grew up in the 1950s and 60s when communism was in its big push all over the world. So after World War II, we saw one country after another in Europe, Asia, and Latin America going communist. We saw right after World War II, Poland, East Germany, Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, all these countries being taken over by the communists and turning into slave states, prison states, totalitarian dictatorships. And then in our own hemisphere, particularly with Cuba, when Fidel Castro took over there, and of course the biggest one being in China, right after World War II, 1949, where China and then ultimately Korea and North Vietnam becoming communist states. So that's the milieu in which I grew up, and it was very much on the conscience of everyone during the Cold War period that communism was a big thing. And then, concomitant with that, not just the communism from without, but the communism within. We had spectacularly in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, many top communists in top positions of our government. The most famous cases being Alger Hiss, but Harry Dexter White, the Rosenbergs, atom bomb spies. So all of that was happening at the same time that there was a big cultural subversion going on, the communist cultural subversion. So that's what I grew up in. And so I was very much aware of all of that. When I started to work in the 1970s for the John Birch Society, which is the largest anti-communist organization in the country and in the world, I began a number of other things, not only studying. So one of the ways you get knowledge and expertise about something is either by experience or by study. And so I elected to do both. And I went undercover in communist organizations like the Communist Party USA, which is the official party, the official criminal organization.
So you're basically acting like a spy.
Right, in the Communist Party USA. But there were a bunch of other communist parties that were either Maoist or Trotskyite, like the Socialist Workers' Party, the Progressive Labor Party, the Communist Party, Marxist, Leninist, fractions of the communist movement, which were all active in Southern California. And so that's where I concentrated my work there. I was working at that time also with the Western Goals Foundation. The Western Goals Foundation was a foundation set up by Congressman Larry McDonald, who was the chairman of the John Birch Society, but he was also a member of Congress, one of the most articulate and promising young members of Congress. He was a surgeon, a doctor, was one of the leaders in the House of Representatives, recognized as the top enemy of the Soviet Union. They were always attacking him. And he set up a foundation, which I was working with, along with J. Edward Griffin, Admiral Thomas Moore, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Patton, the son of General Patton of World War II fame.
Admiral Thomas More, that's not the same guy from the story in the book and the film We Were Soldiers, is it?
No, that was
General Hal Moore.
General Hal Moore. Admiral Thomas Moore, spelt different, was the... I did interview General Hal Moore, though, also. But Admiral Moore and General John Singlaub and a number of other high-level military and intelligence people worked with us. So they recognized that during this time we had right in our own hemisphere, with the Sandinistas taking over Nicaragua and revolutions going all over, that we also had big contingents of those forces here in the United States. And so I was working with them to put together a database so that we could inform the American people. And G. Edward Griffin was putting together documentaries, which I helped and worked on. So I came at it from several different areas, as well as working with one of my interests was to really find out what is going on in the world. And I had the good opportunity to meet and interview many refugees, escapees, converts from communism, many from the Soviet Union, from China, Cambodia, from Laos, from Vietnam, from Latin America. And so I wasn't just reading about these things, I was actually getting secondhand information from people who had actually been communists themselves, or who had been victims of communism and had escaped from there. And
So senior editor of the New American, I guess you could say senior editor of the senior editors, since you've been at it far longer than any of the others. And here's just one of the issues of the New American as an example. Your two books, well, this is your first one here, Global Tyranny Step by Step on the United Nations, and then the second one, The UN Exposed. Investigative journalist, editor, author, former communist spy in spying on the communists. But you also mentioned that, working for the John Birch Society, and the New American is a publication of the John Birch Society. But isn't the John Birch Society and the New American and the Epoch Times and these kinds of things, aren't they just these, radical right-wing extremist fringe conspiracy theorist groups?
Yeah, so of course that's what we have been hearing. That's what we've been subjected to for decades. But in the past 7-8 years, most Americans have come to realize that anyone who goes against the woke, what we now call the woke agenda, but which is really the Marxist agenda, is going to be called a racist, a homophobe, a transphobe, a misogynist. You're going to be called a fascist, a white nationalist. So those extremist labels have been fastened on everyone who has, throughout history, who has stood up against what we now know as the communist revolution. And we'll probably get into that later, but those are some of the people that I have interviewed or have admired. And so we have everyone that has come forward out of the communist movement, even top members of the communist movement, whether it's Whittaker Chambers, Elizabeth Bentley, Bella Dodd, Manning Johnson, Paul Crouch. There are hundreds who have seen the light finally. There was a book in 1949 called The God That Failed. And it was a number of former communists, most of them famous, Ignacio Salon, Arthur Kessler, André Gide, who left the Communist Party because they finally had the scales come off their eyes, and they saw what communism really was. And for many of them, it took Stalin's purges and the gulags and everything to finally shake them out of their delusion, and they realized their god of communism had failed.
But for others, they just still believed in it and they just changed tactics, right?
Sure. And so, unfortunately, far too many, the so-called, either the romance of communism or those that were actually in the communist movement, the desire for power themselves, overrode all of the evidence before their eyes that put to the lie the charge that the communists were trying to build this ideal utopian society.
So JBS and other similar groups are often labeled as these wacky conspiracy theorist fringe groups, but you were telling me a while back about kind of the history of how that conspiracy theorist labelism came about. Can you briefly explain that?
Yeah, so right now that is one of the primary tactics being used to discredit anyone who starts pointing out some of the obvious dots that need to be connected here. I find it amusing and at the same time aggravating that so many people, conservatives, particularly politicians, as soon as they start pointing out something, they'll say, "But I'm not a conspiracy theorist."
Yeah.
It demonstrates that we have been so conditioned that psychologically we have to automatically disassociate ourselves from that.
I mean, the left, they can cry conspiracy theory all they want, and nobody has a problem with that. I mean, they're doing that right now, calling, actually in court, accusing Trump of conspiracy theory. They're saying, conspiracy theory. Yeah.
They're indicting Trump on conspiracy. They're charging him with conspiracy on the election, with conspiracy on January 6th. They do it every day. All of the January 6th people who have been held unconstitutionally, they accuse them of conspiracy. So this happens all the time. Throughout soon before Trump was even inaugurated, they were accusing him of conspiracy with Putin and with Russia, and then it was conspiracy in Ukraine, and then it was conspiracy in Georgia,
and in the previous elections, the Democrats were constantly denying Republican win elections for, back with the George Bush elections, and every time the Republicans, they would call, fake fraudulent elections and whatnot. But now on the other side, anybody who says it was a fake election they're conspiracy theorists.
Or even challenges that, hey, there was something wrong going on here.
Yeah. So how did that come about?
It's been building for a long time. So when I first started getting my eyes opened in college, I read a book by a man who became a friend of mine and who I worked with.
Real quick there, reading books. How large is your personal library?
Well, I won't know completely until I get all the books out of the box. We had, as you know, a fire here.
But
4.5 years ago.
Last you estimated?
Somewhere around 14 to 15,000 volumes. So,
and you've read most of them?
Well, most of them are, and I have notes and post-it tabs in most of them.
Okay.
So, a very good friend of mine, became a good friend of mine, was Gary Allen. He was the author of the runaway bestseller, None Dare Call It Conspiracy. Came out in the 60s, and it was a sensational paperback, and I read it, and there were so many facts and factoids in there that I hadn't heard of before, that the paperback didn't have footnotes in it. And so I finally found a hardback copy of it, which was all footnoted. I was going to the university at the time, so I spent a great deal of time in the university
University of Moscow, Idaho.
University of Idaho in Moscow, yes.
Moscow, Idaho, not Moscow, Russia.
Idaho, yeah. And so back then, we didn't have the internet, of course. Nobody had even heard of the internet or thought of it at that time. So if you wanted to check out footnotes, you either had to go to the stacks and find the books and do that.
And you, at that time, you yourself were a Marxist, right?
Well, not at that time. I was already starting.
Earlier.
Yeah, earlier. So my senior year in high school and freshman year in college, I would classify myself in the radical Marxist category. And it's kind of interesting, and I've thought about it a lot over the years. How did that happen? Because originally, growing up in the 50s and 60s and going to Catholic schools.
Hey, you were born and raised Catholic, right? And you were already, 10 years old by the time Second Vatican Council started.
Right. I served my first Mass in 1959 or 1960, of course, Latin Mass. And I was an altar boy, and I always served in the Latin Mass. That didn't actually get implemented into the Novus Ordo in most places until the late 60s. And so during most of that time, I was serving Latin Mass. And in our Catholic schools, this was during a time when Vietnam was being taken over by the communists. And Dr. Tom Dooley, Catholic doctor, had some famous books about that: Deliver Us from Evil, The Night They Burned the Mountain, those kind of things, and which told about what the communist atrocities they were doing in Vietnam. And so, but as I got into my later years in high school, this is where the cultural Marxism, the cultural subversion comes in, because we had the big British rock invasion, the Beatles and the Stones and everything, and then all of the Haight-Ashbury, the hippies and everything, and then the big thing, Woodstock.
Oh yeah.
And so I wasn't at Woodstock, but everybody that wasn't at Woodstock wanted to be at Woodstock, and vicariously lived it through the videos and the records and tapes of Woodstock. And so that had a big impact on a lot of people, and of course the Vietnam War did at that time. And again, this gets into the cultural subversion and the media, because the media were so overwhelmingly pro-communist, pro-Viet Cong, pro-North Vietnam, and anti-American, and constantly bombarding everybody with this about how we were oppressing this poor little nation, and Ho Chi Minh, the communist dictator of North Vietnam, was the hero and the inspiration for freedom-loving Vietnamese. And so gradually that had an impact on me, and particularly because I had older cousins and friends in college, and I was a precocious reader, so I was always reading, and that is a good thing if you're reading the right things. If you're reading the wrong things, it can be very hazardous, and that's what happened to me. I was constantly being fed subversive literature, and gradually that had an impact on me. However, the saving grace was my parents, who were devout Catholics. They prayed for me. They were very worried about me. And I always loved and respected them, even when I thought they were off base on things. But anyway, when I read Gary Allen's book, None Dare Call It Conspiracy, it put things into a perspective for me that I hadn't seen before, and it filled in a lot of the spaces that were missing in the puzzle picture. And then when I went to the library and got on the microfiche and the microfilm and started getting the footnote sources and copying them and reading them, I thought, well, it checks out. That started me on a long journey to find out, okay, I've been blind about quite a bit, how much? And I started looking. Here I'd already been several years in college. By the time I finished, I was 5 years at university, and I found that just in a couple of years of reading the materials that I had gotten from the Birch Society and checking those out, that I'd learned far more than I had in all my college experience. And I found out that, dang, everything has been polluted. Our history, and this goes back to the even before the turn of the century, but very assiduously, methodically, the pro-communist, pro-socialist, anti-Christian bias had been put into the history books and in the sociology and whatnot by John Dewey, by Walter Rauschenbusch, by all these people right at the beginning of the 20th century. And it had been building ever since. And so so I realized I've got a lifelong journey of reading and unlearning the misinformation and disinformation which I've had, and trying to get a grasp on who are the individuals, the organizations, and the forces that are subverting our culture, our economy, our political institutions, and our religious institutions.
Yeah, so I was kind of getting a long way getting there, but because I'm kind of diverting you, but the origin of that conspiracy theorist mindset, of accusing,
Yeah, well, actually, one of the earliest examples we have of that, and I'll get the date wrong, but I think it was in 1963. I have the CIA document. The CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, the U.S. government, proposed, actually put forward the idea that, well, we need to accuse people of promoting conspiracy theories when they start pointing at high-level machinations, collusion, conspiracy in government. We have to discredit with that term conspiracy theory, label lynch people with it. And that has, particularly in the past few years, become just standard operating procedure. And it is my belief that we can and must make that as ineffectual as the racism charge. Mm-hmm. Is there really racism? Yes, there is racism, and we need to find ways to properly deal with it. Are there crazy conspiracy theories? Yes, there are crazy conspiracy theories. That doesn't mean there aren't real conspiracies. And in fact...
And conspiracy facts.
Conspiracy facts. There are, every year, at the state and federal and local level, there are thousands of cases of conspiracy brought about. What is conspiracy? Conspiracy means two or more people acting in unison to achieve an illegal or immoral purpose. Do you need to...
I think it was this camera. I'll go reset it. It has a time limit. It only record for so long.
So, every time conspiracy.
In the courts and thousands.
Yeah, so we have every year in the courts, prosecutors bringing conspiracy charges against individuals.
Definition. What is conspiracy theories?
Well, a conspiracy is two or more people engaging secretly to accomplish an illegal or immoral purpose. And we see conspiracy charges brought against people all the time in the drug cartels, in organized crime, and in racketeering cases. And thousands of times every year, prosecutors bring conspiracy charges. As we already mentioned, President Trump is being charged with conspiracy by the same people who denounce conspiracy theories all the time. So that's what we saw during the
And then charging him for denying the election when the left, the Democrats, have been doing that for decades.
Right. So one of the big heroes today of the left is Stacey Abrams.
Yeah.
And she is still denying that she lost
Right.
her Senate race in Georgia. Hillary Clinton, of course.
Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden were denying the George Bush-Al Gore election.
Right. So what this shows is that we are devolving rapidly toward beyond an authoritarian toward a totalitarian state. We're becoming more and more like the Soviet system or the Chinese system, where the so-called justice system, the prosecutorial and judicial system, is used against political opponents, and without regard to any kind of due process or any respect for the need for factual evidence.
Let's see here. So that's kind of a long introduction here. So to kickstart us off more on the history of communism, a viewer of mine commented on the last video I put out on the Chant Academy channel announcing where I announced this new channel and this episode. And in that video, I said, well, with my dad, we'll be talking about, communism, something which Our Lady of Fatima warned against. But to be accurate, as I thought later, well, no, Our Lady of Fatima, she actually didn't say communism. What she said was the errors of Russia, which for most Catholics, it's easily enough to see the connection there. It's the errors of Russia, communism, pretty much the same thing. But this gentleman is a bit, in my opinion, confused. And so I'd like to read that part of that comment as to kind of like launch us forward, because obviously he's not the only one that's confused in this. And I have no disrespect, no judgment on this gentleman, but so he says, where is it here? Quote, "I look forward to Pipes with Augustine. It's great that you're interviewing your dad. From the use of the word warn, however, I humbly suggest that authoritarianism is what Our Lady of Fatima addressed, not the egalitarian principles of communism per se. Many Catholic priests and nuns, especially in the Americas, have been openly supportive of socialist models of government and community building. Heroes of modern Catholic culture like Archbishop Romero, Sister Helen Prejean, and Father Blaise Bonpane. For those of you who don't know who Father Blaise Bonpane is, he was a former Maryknoll priest who I assume was laicized. I haven't been able to find any information on whether he was laicized or not. All I know is he was kicked out of the Maryknoll organization and presumably laicized because he then married a former Maryknoll nun, which kind of reminds me of like Martin Luther. But he and his wife, like the Maryknoll order, became proponents of liberation theology, which tries to merge the Gospels with Marxism. So he says, heroes of modern Catholic culture like Archbishop Romero, Sister Helen Prejean, Father Blaise Bonpane have worked amiably with democratic socialist organizations and even Central American insurgent groups, understanding that some various perspectives were drawn from the writings of Antonio Gramsci, Karl Marx, Goldman, Freire, Desjardins, Allende, and Marty. The core messages of Jesus of Nazareth were far more consistent with a society-wide shared wealth system than a top-controlled concentration of wealth. These are not new dialogues, of course, and I think they aren't settled by a long ways. But with heavenly music, brotherly love, and handcrafted beer, mine's all gone, all things are possible, right? Well, thank you very much to this gentleman who provided this comment, because I think it's a good launching point and discussion for not only for Catholics who are already opposed to communism but just don't have a very good understanding of it, but also for those who are confused about it. And so before we continue with any further questions to you, I'd just like to take a few minutes, just 5-6 minutes, to read some excerpts from various papal encyclicals regarding socialism and communism, so we can see very clearly what the church teaches, addressing socialism and communism by name. So, beginning, first of all, going back to Pius IX, we read, quote, "To this goal also," and here he's speaking about the destruction of clerical celibacy and the perversion of youth, he says, quote, "To this goal also tends the unspeakable doctrine of communism, a doctrine most opposed to the very natural law. For if this doctrine were accepted, the complete destruction of everyone's laws, government, property, and even human society itself would follow." End quote. Pius IX from his encyclical Qui Pluribus from 1846. Again, quote, "The goal of this most iniquitous plot is to drive people to overthrow the entire order of human affairs and to draw them over to the wicked theories of this socialism and communism by confusing them with perverted teachings. The special goal of their proponents is to introduce to the people the pernicious fictions of socialism and communism by misapplying the terms liberty and equality. The final goal shared by these teachings is to excite by continuous disturbances workers and others, especially those of the lower class, whom they have deceived by their lies and deluded by the promise of a happier condition. It is your duty, venerable brothers, to help the faithful realize that if they let themselves be deceived by such perverted doctrines and theories, these theories will cause their temporal and their eternal destruction." End quote. Pius IX from his encyclical Nostis et Nobiscum, 1849. Again, quote, "The progress so preached by these revolutionary men aim only to keep the agitations alive, to eliminate every principle of justice, virtue, honesty, religion, and to introduce, propagate, and cause to dominate everywhere, with gravest harm and ruin to all human society, the horrendous and fatal system of socialism, or even communism as it is called, which is most contrary to natural reason and natural law itself." End quote. And then he refers to it as, quote, "this blackest conspiracy, or rather this long series of conspiracies." End quote. Pius IX from his allocution Quibus Quantisque Malis, 1849. So I guess Pius IX is a conspiracy theorist too, you know. I would also recommend his other encyclical Quanta Cura, 1864. Again, just taking a couple minutes here. Leo XIII. Quote, "At the very beginning of our pontificate, we hastened to point out the deadly plague that is creeping into the very fibers of human society and leading it on to the verge of destruction. You understand, venerable brethren, that we speak of socialists, communists, or nihilists, and who, bound together by the closest ties in a wicked confederacy or conspiracy, strive to bring to a head what they have long been planning, the overthrow of all civil society whatsoever. For indeed, although the socialists, stealing the very gospel itself with a view to deceive more easily the unwary, have been accustomed to distort it so as to suit their own purposes, nevertheless, so great is the difference between their depraved teachings and the most pure doctrine of Christ that none greater could exist." End quote. Pope Leo XIII, quote from his encyclical Quod Apostolici Munadis, 1878. So apparently Leo XIII is also a conspiracy theorist. I would also recommend his other encyclical Quod Multum from 1886, and of course Rerum Nevarum from 1891. And then finally, Pius XI. Quote, and this is from his encyclical, really focused heavily on communism. Quote, "Communism teaches and seeks two objectives: unrelenting class warfare and absolute extermination of private ownership. To achieve these objectives, there is nothing which it does not dare. And when it has come to power, it is incredible and portent-like in its cruelty and inhumanity. We have summoned communism and socialism again to judgment and have found all their forms, even the most modified, to wander far from the precepts of the gospel." End quote. Pius XI, Quadragesimo Anno, 1931. Actually, it's the next encyclical which is focused more specifically on communism. Quote, "In 1924, when our relief mission returned from the Soviet Union, we condemned communism in a special allocution which we addressed to the whole world. The communism of today, more emphatically than similar movements in the past, conceals itself in a false messianic idea. A pseudo-ideal of justice, of equality, and fraternity in labor impregnates all its doctrine and activity with a deceptive mysticism, which communicates a zealous and contagious enthusiasm to the multitudes entrapped by delusive promises. In the beginning, communism showed itself for what it was, in all its perversity, but very soon it realized that it was thus alienating people. It has therefore changed its tactics and strives to entice the multitudes by trickery of various forms, hiding its real designs behind ideas that in themselves are good and attractive. Under various names which do not suggest communism, they establish organizations and periodicals with the sole purpose of carrying their ideas into quarters otherwise inaccessible. They try perfidiously to worm their way even into professedly Catholic and religious organizations. Again, without receding an inch from their subversive principles, they invite Catholics to collaborate with them in the realm of so-called humanitarianism and charity, and at times even make proposals that are in perfect harmony with the Christian spirit and the doctrine of the Church. Elsewhere, they carry their hypocrisy so far as to encourage the belief that communism, in countries where faith and culture are more strongly entrenched, like Latin America, will assume another and much milder form. It will not interfere with the practice of religion. It will respect liberty of conscience. There are some even who refer to certain changes recently introduced into Soviet legislation as a proof that communism is about to abandon its program of war against God. See to it, venerable brethren, that the faithful do not allow themselves to be deceived. There's another important aspect of communism that many good Catholics are unaware of its tie to communism. Communism is particularly, continuing Pius XI, communism is particularly characterized by the rejection of any link that binds woman to the family and the home, and her emancipation is proclaimed as a basic principle. She is withdrawn from the family and the care of her children to be thrust instead into public life and collective production under the same conditions as man. The care of home and children then devolves upon the collectivity. Daycare. Finally, the right of education is denied to parents. How many parents homeschool their children anymore? For it is conceived as the exclusive prerogative of the community, in whose name and by whose mandate alone parents may exercise this right. And then, as this last paragraph is, I think, Pius XI addressing himself to gentlemen such as that made this comment and others. It's like a loving father addressing himself to these. We cannot conclude this encyclical letter without addressing some words to those of our children who are more or less tainted with the communist plague. We earnestly exhort them to hear the voice of their loving Father. We pray the Lord to enlighten them, that they may abandon the slippery path which will precipitate one and all to the ruin and catastrophe, and that they recognize that Jesus Christ our Lord is their only Savior. For there is no other name under heaven given to man whereby we must be saved. End quote. Pius XI from his encyclical Divini Redemptoris, 1937. Continuing on in this tradition, you then have Pius XII in his encyclical Ad Apostolorum Principis in 1958, Paul VI in his apostolic letter Octogesima Adveniens, 1971, which is the celebration of the 80th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, and then again John Paul II in his encyclical Centesimus Annus, 1991, the 100th anniversary of Rerum Novarum. So we see that for over 150 years now, this tradition of the popes continually teaching the same thing, condemning Marxism, socialism, communism as utterly as the one of them, I forget who it was, said there's couldn't be any greater difference between socialism and communism and the teachings of Christ and the gospel. They're completely incompatible. And as I think we'll see later, I'll read another quote where I forget which one of the popes it is, says you cannot have any association with communism whatsoever. So where's my other notes?
Along those lines, let me just say what the gentleman suggested there. He named Blaise Bonpane and Fray Beto and a few others. liberation theology has been condemned by the church. It is an attempt to meld Marxism, Leninism with the gospel. And it has come about as a permutation since those were written. However, I had some personal experience with that. I went to Nicaragua. I was there when the Sandinistas were, after they had taken over and ruled for 10 years, the Sandinista communists. And then with the election of Violeta Chamorro, who had been a Sandinista. She was a widow of a publisher, newspaper publisher there. She became the new president, so I was there for her inauguration. And but the Sandinistas came back into power 10 years later, and the communist dictator there, Daniel Ortega, claims to be a Catholic. Originally, he was very anti-Catholic. Then when he came back in, he pretended to be a Catholic, and now he's been persecuting the church again, as they did before. And some of the people who your correspondent there had mentioned, Blaise Bonpane, for instance, was very comradely with Fidel Castro and with the Sandinista communists.
And Cesar Chavez.
And we had several in the Sandinista communist regime, while they were persecuting the church, while they were persecuting the all of the people there, particularly the indigenous people that they claimed to represent. We had 4 priests, Catholic priests, who were part of the regime and who were carrying out many of these persecutions. The Cardinal brothers, Ernesto and Fernando Cardinal, Miguel de Escoto, and the 4th one. Anyway, they were all, one of the Cardinals was a Jesuit, one was a Maryknoll, one was a diocesan priest. But they were really communists in clerical robes. And they worked hand in hand with the Cuban DGI, which is the communist secret police. And so that's what we're really dealing with many of the people whom your correspondent, your gentleman, had said are heroes of Latin America. They're only heroes to those people who are either ignorant or who are deceptively using the Catholic Church and other Christian churches to promote their anti-Christian cause.
So, as I understand communism, is that it essentially seeks to destroy the soul, ultimately to destroy the soul and take souls to hell, to destroy belief in God and morality so that people will think and act like they are nothing more than matter, in which case morality doesn't exist. And in which case those in power can then more easily control the masses with a common conscience, as if they were just a pack of rats. And then the Communist Manifesto itself states that communism, quote, abolishes all religion, all morality, end quote. But obviously the Communist Manifesto was written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, but they didn't necessarily invent communism, socialism. So it really goes back and is kind of born during the French Revolution, right? So can you explain, like, how did this idea of socialism and communism first come about?
Okay, so one of the first quotes that you read from was Pope Pius IX.
Yeah.
And that was in 1846. So that was 2 years before the Communist Manifesto was written.
Yeah.
And he said those organizations and movements that had been proceeding along for quite some time. He didn't mention specifically the French Revolution, but previous popes had. So when Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, he was actually commissioned to do so. There was growing at that time a socialist, communist, nihilist movement, which had been percolating for quite some time, going back to even preceding the French Revolution. And there are quite it's quite a detailed and intricate arrangement or study of all of these things. And some very good studies have been done of this, which trace all of this out. One of the best being by the Catholic priest Abbe Augustine Beruel, who wrote a 4-volume work called Memoirs Illustrating the History of Jacobinism. He was a French priest who had to flee France, went to England,
and what was his time period? When did he live?
Well, he lived during the French Revolution. Okay. He died in
like the first one in the 1700s.
Yes. So, his books were very hard to obtain. Now they have been all published in a single volume. When I was looking for them, I had to go to the UCLA library, check out. You had to go through all kinds of security to check out these books, and then I took them and copied them. And the same with another one that came out in 1798, the same year that another book by Professor John Robison of Scotland, of the Royal Society there. He was one of the most famous textbook writers and professors of chemistry and science at that time. He wrote a book called Proofs of a Conspiracy. And they, in those books, showed that what happened in France during the French Revolution was not as we are popularly told in our histories, that the French people rose up against a corrupt king and aristocracy, overthrew the king, and then it kind of spun out of control. What both of those very important books show is that there were secret societies, Masonic organizations, and particularly the Order of the Illuminati.
That's a conspiracy, right?
Yeah. And that's why I bring up these two books, because they are very important as documentary evidence. Because today, if you just put in Illuminati, you'll get all kinds of crazy stuff all over.
And there is a lot of wacky, crazy stuff.
There's very crazy, wacky stuff. And so that's why I, over 50 years ago, went to try to find all of these original sources. And originally, John Robison's book was not available. George Washington had a copy of it. He read it, and he believed in it back then. But it was very hard to find. A friend of mine, this was pre-internet, now you can find things on Amazon. There wasn't an Amazon or anything like that. So he used professional book services all over Europe, and he got 5 copies of the original manuscripts from 1798 of Proofs of a Conspiracy and of Abbe Beruel's books. So he spent a lot of money to get them. Now they're available, and so you don't have to go to all these crazy sites that claim
wacky,
claim that these are reptilian shapeshifters from another dimension or something like that. Because what is clear in the French Revolution is that there was conspiracy and design behind it, that there were secret groups and combinations working to overthrow, alter, and overthrow all civil society and overthrow religion. And so the key individuals in there, all of the another very important book in that regard, by an establishment source, more contemporary, James H. Billington, the librarian of the Library of Congress. He wrote a book called Fire in the Minds of Men. Big, thick book. I have it upstairs. You can borrow it. And in there, he surveys all of the literature and looks at the forces behind the tumult, those that have been in the shadows and in the smoke. And so he looks at Weishaupt, Adam Weishaupt, the founder of the Order of Illuminati, looks at Count Mirabeau, who was one of the Illuminists who brought the Illuminati Freemasonic message to France from Germany.
Right, and this coincides with the Age of Enlightenment, right?
Well, yes, just subsequent to that. Most of the people in the Enlightenment were not Illuminists, but they were so many of the people in the so-called Enlightenment were giddy with the heady experience of all the new knowledge that they were learning. And this is the problem that you see over and over again with so-called intellectuals, is that there's this pride that I'm so brilliant now, I'm so smart, I've come up with a new idea, a new philosophy, and I've already rejected that I need any kind of divine sanction. So I am my own God. And that is what the Illuminists believe, that it was really the Luciferian satanic temptation, the conceit that I can be my own God, I can be like God. And so we see that imbuing the French Revolution, which is recognized in all of Marx, Lenin, Stalin, Ho Chi Minh, Mao Zedong, Pol Pot. All of them revere the French Revolution and write about it in their writings. They take that as the fountainhead from which liberty, equality, fraternity has come. And not only the supposed ideals of it, but the tactics and the strategies that were used to overthrow existing society. With the French Revolution, they not only got rid of the king and the aristocrats and everything, but got rid of the whole calendar. They said, we're starting it's year one. We're going to start everything anew, and then we're going to tear down everything and rebuild it. And
build back better, right?
Build back better, yeah. And
Great reset.
Yeah. So
who were Babeuf and Buonarroti? What did they do, and what was their involvement?
Okay, so well, that gets into the weeds a little bit, but we can. So Gracchus Babeuf and Philippe Buonarroti were conspirators who were Illuminists, but within the faction which had taken control after the French Revolution and that ended up in control was the Jacobins, or Jacobins, people referred. And Mirabeau and the Duc d'Orleans and Danton and Robespierre, they were all Jacobins. And, they brought about the guillotine and all of the rest of the Great Terror. But Babeuf and Buonarroti and their conspiracy of equals, it could be compared in other revolutions like the Bolshevik Revolution and whatnot to the Bolsheviks.
Yeah, there's the camera again.
That can't be reset? Why does Canon do that?
No, it's on their cheaper cameras. On their cheaper cameras like that, I think it's for a heat, so it doesn't overheat or something. I don't know. They have a time limit on the recording.
So it could be compared to, for instance, in the Bolshevik Revolution. Very early on, you had the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. In 1917, and it wasn't until October that the Bolsheviks really took over, and Babeuf could be compared to the Bolsheviks, but he didn't quite have the organizational heft and savvy that he thought he did. Their conspiracy was was found out, and so the Directory had them executed. And they were not, but he was calling for an even more radical overthrow of everything than the French Revolution.
What was like his philosophy that he was?
Well, his philosophy was that everything has to go, that we have to completely get rid of all property altogether, which of course is a communist operation. The original French Revolutionists had already gone a long way in that, but not quite that far. So he was executed, but Buonarroti wasn't. Buonarroti would become, in fact, I have one book that's titled that, The First Professional Revolutionary. He went to Germany, went to Italy, and spread the Illuminist ideology, and then Auguste Blanqui, his disciple, carried that on further, and the Carbonari in Italy did further, and that's where the instructions of the Alta Vendita came out of after that. So you see in the French Revolution the same thing that we see in every communist revolution, and it has caused the expression, the revolution eats its own, because in the Bolshevik Revolution, in we already mentioned the Sandinista Revolution in Nicaragua, same thing. Many of the communist leaders end up being executed, sent to the gulags, tortured and killed one way or another, because when you get a bunch of criminals together, and that's what we really have to understand communism as, it is a criminal enterprise. And every communist dictatorship, every communist state is a criminal state. It is as if a drug cartel or a mafia family took over a geopolitical piece of real estate. And that's really how we have to look at it. So your friend that wrote in and says, well, the idealistic, egalitarian thing, no, that is all part of the cover. These are really criminals. And in fact, many of them were street criminals before they became revolutionary criminals. Daniel Ortega was a bank robber. Joseph Stalin was the Tiflis bank robber. Many of them were vicious criminals, street criminals, before they decided to turn there.
Well, and like I just quoted earlier, I mean, Karl Marx himself in the Communist Manifesto says that communism abolishes all religion, abolishes all morals.
All morality.
So, I mean, like whichever of the popes it was said, I mean, there's no, you can't have any association with communism. There's no greater difference between their depraved teachings and the teachings of the gospel. I mean,
right. So, I mean,
they can't.
Whatever advances the communist revolution to them is moral, which means murder, lying, cheating, stealing is not only permissible but encouraged.
Yeah. So how did socialism then go from the French Revolution to Marx and Engels, and did they just continue the same thought process, or did they develop it?
Yes. So most of the principles laid out by various of the French revolutionists, including Babeuf and Buonarroti, were adopted by Marx. But Marx was a German and much more given to very methodical analysis and putting everything down in economic and political terms.
He's a philosopher too, right?
Yes, but so his big works, of course, are the Communist Manifesto and Capital. And nobody ever reads Capital. Now, I've slogged through it and taken all kinds of notes and everything on it.
Was it Das Kapital?
Das Kapital.
Yeah.
And but it's very difficult to make sense of a lot of it. Much of it is is overwhelming in that he wrote most of it in London and at the Royal Library, and he has all kinds of statistics that supposedly prove his theories and whatnot. However, in one of his letters, it might have been, it wasn't to Engels, it was to another, someone he was corresponding with, and they were commenting on how ponderous and long it was. And he says, well, I wrote this for Germans. He says, they judge it by how much excrement, how many pounds of excrement are in it. So he admitted that he larded it with all kinds of stuff just to make it more impressive.
Yeah.
So Marx, of course, when he wrote the Communist Manifesto, was commissioned to do so. Well, if you're commissioned to do so, that suggests there is someone commissioning. And it was the League of Just Men. And they had called him to do this because they knew he was a prodigious writer, and they needed something in 1848. They were planning, the communist organizations at that time were already planning revolutions all over Europe. And they needed a pamphlet that they could use as a rallying point. And so they hired him to write it, and he and Engels, and he wrote it, and his name wasn't even on it for, I think, the first 40 or 50 years. And then later...
was Engels' name on it?
Not at first. Neither. It was just the communists. But Marx, and we just had his anniversary here that the New York Times and everybody last year celebrated and gave all kinds of plaudits and accolades to.
But Marx was he was kind of, he followed Hegel, didn't he? So, and his Hegelian dialectics, but he kind of modified that. So,
right. So he calls it materialist dialectics, the Hegelian dialectic, but materialist, whereas Hegel was an idealist. And so Marx and others who were taken with Hegel's philosophy and his synthesis proposition of contradiction. You know, you have different forces contradicting each other, different ideas or ideals contradicting each other. But as they meet, there's modification and a synthesis. And
through that conflict, they then progress into something further.
Right. And so Marx took this into a materialist view, because Marx and the communists claim that we live in a totally materialist world. There is no such thing as spirit. There is no such thing as God. There is no such thing as a soul. We are all just matter in motion. And so everything is materialist. So everything is actual material substance. So we have to explain everything in those terms. And when it comes to social interactions, that has to be explained in materialist terms also. So they see a thing that they claim is wrong, and sometimes they're correct in saying that something is wrong or unjust. There's somebody here being truly oppressed.
Well, it's like there's always a bit of truth in every heresy. So
Sure. And the key thing is that any issue that they focus on is a way to use a contradiction to bring about conflict, which they can exploit for the synthesis that they already have planned.
Right. So that must be part of then his the 5 stages of civilization.
Right. It's been sometimes, he doesn't actually put it in 5 stages like that. Some put it as 6 or some in 5, but he starts out in the primitive or tribal society, hunter-gatherer, and then as people aggregate, they form the polis, the city, or the town. And then when you have that, that's when the class struggle begins, because people start staking out property, but then you start producing more, and you go from there to capitalism, and which of course is their primary target. And from capitalism, as you have more conflict and synthesis, you then progress to socialism, and socialism takes all the property and everything together, centralizes power, and once that happens, you have a dictatorship of the proletariat, and it will result in communism, and the state, the central power state, will then wither away, and everybody will have everything equally.
Right. So according to his theoretical teaching, then, I don't know whether he truly believed in it or not, or whether it was just rhetoric, but according to that, then, once you finally arrive at the utopian stage of communism, that concentration of power in the state they would either give it up, or it would just naturally dissolve. That's the theory, right? So there, yeah, so you like an anarchy without chaos.
Right. So he's saying that. So that
everyone will just
presupposes some kind of total renovation, rejuvenation of the human being, because we would no longer have sin or any
redemption without Christ in the church.
So it is a gospel of materialist redemption, and of course, no one who thinks it through, as the popes have said, or looks at the experience. I mean, it was one thing back then, in the 19th century, the 18th and 19th century, to propose these things. It hadn't really been tried out.
Right.
But by very early in the 20th century, we saw in Bolshevik Russia and everywhere else it was being implemented that this was turning not into the utopia they planned, the workers' paradise, but the workers' hell.
Real quickly, what was the 1871 Paris Commune and the Reign of Terror?
Okay, give me the date again.
The 1871 Paris Commune.
Okay, so the Reign of Terror is usually associated with the
Okay. Go ahead.
Okay, so those are two separate things. The Reign of Terror is in the original French Revolution, 1789 to 94. That's when you had most people associate it with the guillotine. But the French revolutionists carried out mass murder in drownings, they call noyades, where they just put people out on rafts, bind them all together, poke holes in it and let them drown, because they said the guillotine was too slow. They had their cannonades, where they would just herd everybody out into fields and turn cannons on them and blow them up. So that was the Great Terror. And of course, most people have not heard of the counter-revolution, the Catholic opposition from the Vendée, which was a very heroic struggle by the people in the Loire Valley, primarily, who said enough is enough, and they fought back, and they won many victories before ultimately being defeated, and very horribly treated, executed, tortured, etc. after that. But so following Napoleon Bonaparte's overthrow of the Jacobins, We then had, after he was overthrown and the restoration of the monarchy, we had a series of revolutions, and the culminating in the Commune of 1871, and that was a very short-lived one, which has been romanticized and promoted in the century since then as this wonderful romantic effort to again reestablish the ideals of the French Revolution. And so we have had ever since then references to it and appeals to it in the name of communist revolutions all over the world.
So Karl Marx, wonderful, wonderful man, right? In 1841, he wrote the poem "The Fiddler," and in the poem, this fiddler is playing wildly, frantically, and someone asks him, "Why are you playing so frantically?" And he responds, "Why do I fiddle? That the eye be blinded, that bosom swell, that soul's cry carry down to hell." And so then the person replies back, and I'm paraphrasing here, "Why? Like a radiant, beautiful God gave you your art." And he responds back, "How so? I plunge without fail my blood-black saber into your soul. That art God neither wants nor wists, it leaps to the brain from hell's black mists. Till hearts bewitched, till senses reel, with Satan I have struck my deal. He chalks the signs, beats time for me, I play the death march fast and free." So either he's describing himself being possessed, or at least he is willfully and knowingly working for Satan against God.
Well, yes. So there is. I first became aware of that and other poems and things that he had written. It was probably about 40 years ago, when Reverend Richard Wurmbrand, who was a Romanian Lutheran minister who was imprisoned and tortured. He wrote a book, Tortured for Christ, and a very heroic man, Christian. And he wrote a book, Marx and Satan, in which he dug out a whole plethora of references not only to Marx but other communist leaders. Now, we're told that the communists are atheists, and indeed they are. They established the League of Militant Atheists in Russia after they took over to eradicate all religion, not only Christian, but even Muslim and other ones, but particularly Christian religion. But there is a very disturbing element that runs throughout all of this that shows rather demonic, satanic allegiance. It's not just that they don't believe in God. Many of the communist leaders seem to believe in God. They just hate him and have announced their rebellion, like Satan, against him. And we see this in, for instance, one of the most notable revolutionaries of our age, Saul Alinsky.
Oh, yeah.
So back when I was in college, he was a big thing. Saul Alinsky was an organizer here in the United States, primarily in the Chicago area, but nationwide and even worldwide.
Mentor to Clinton and Obama, right?
Yes, he was a mentor to Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. And in his book, Reveille for Radicals, he dedicates the dedication page to Lucifer, and puts him at, if I paraphrase it, but he says to Lucifer, the first rebel who won for himself his own kingdom. So we see this frequently enough that it's a very disturbing warning that there is something more to the whole communist spirit than simple materialism.
Yeah. So what are the 10 planks, as they're called, the 10 planks, 10 tenets, 10 commandments of communism?
Yes. So God gave Moses the 10 commandments. Marx gave communists their 10 manifesto points.
Or Satan gave Marx the 10.
Yes. From the burning bush to the burning world, this. So I printed out. This is from the Communist Manifesto. He gives 10 planks. First one is abolition of property in land and application of all rents to the land of public purposes. So basically, abolition of property. And this he didn't come up with on his own. Joseph Proudhon and others before him had called for, other socialists had called for abolishing private property. Why? Because if you own your own property, you have your own farm, your own house, your own blacksmith shop, you are not dependent upon the state. The communists want everybody to be beholden to be totally dependent upon the state so that they can...
If you owned property or if you owned the means of production, you were labeled the bourgeois, right?
Right.
So business owners are the bourgeois and the employees are the proletariat, right? And they always wanted to pit them against each other.
And those terms are coming back. Now, back when I was in college in the 60s and 70s, all of the radicals at that time were denouncing bourgeois, middle-class values, bourgeois. They say, oh, you're so bourgeois. Now that's starting to come back. For about 30 years, you didn't hear that very much. But now... Marxism, Leninism is more in vogue, and bourgeois means the middle class. Why are they so opposed to the middle class? Because a middle class indicates that you don't just have... They're always railing against the disparity between the rich and the poor. A middle class belies that.
What was the name they used for the elite rich?
Well, they'd say the rich or the aristocrats. But they primarily focused on the bourgeois, the middle class. They wanted to destroy the middle class. They denounced that all the time. It's the middle class values, the middle class exploitation. If you have a middle class, it belies the claim that there's just a rich and a poor, the rich exploiting poor, because you see in the middle class a lot of the upward social mobility of the proletariat or the peasants, peasants being the rural, proletariat being the urban workers, into the middle class. If you have private property and ability for people to own their own businesses, to carry out their own trade, then you're going to have less and less of that disparity and more people being able to live a decent life. Communists don't want that. They want to have grievance that they can exploit. So that was the first one, and that's always
because that goes back to the philosophy that they need to create this conflict between the two in order that from that conflict they can then progress to the next stage of civilization, socialism and communism. So they felt that conflict was necessary, right?
Right. Number 2 is a heavy progressive graduated income tax.
Oh, that sounds familiar.
Yeah, we got that in 1912 with the graduated income tax here in the United States. And why is that? Well, if you have the government, every time you work real hard and earn a little bit more, they take more and more of it, then you're always oppressed. Abolition of all rights of inheritance. They don't want a father or mother to be able to give their home or their property, their farm, their business to their children. Number 4, confiscation of the property of all emigrants and rebels. An emigrant is somebody who leaves the country. So if somebody is fleeing from you because you're after them to try to kill them or behead them or whatnot, your property is gone. Or if you're a rebel. But here's the thing. In the French Revolution or in every communist revolution, they can declare you a rebel or enemy of the state for any reason whatsoever, and then your property is forfeit. Number 5 is a very important one. Centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital, meaning government capital, and an exclusive monopoly.
Like the Federal Reserve.
Sounds kind of like the Federal Reserve, doesn't it? Yeah, we got that here. Centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. Yeah, so basically that means taking over all the media and all of the transportation.
Which, wasn't it in 1925, the congressional record? Well, the conglomeration of media?
Yeah, so Congressman Calloway put in there about how J.P. Morgan
back in 25? Something like that?
I think so. Commissioned a study to see how many of the newspapers he'd have to buy, this was pre-radio and pre-TV, to buy up to control all of the dissemination and communication of news, and went about doing that. But right now we have more of a fascistic centralized control where the government and the big corporations work together, as we saw in the Twitter files, where the FBI and the DOJ and the White House are colluding with Twitter and Facebook and the other social and general media to censor and to propagate the news that they want. Number 7, extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state. So that means, the state takes over more and more of all the production. And a total communist state, they own it, as in China, they basically own everything. Even now, under the supposed Deng Xiaoping reforms, where you have all of these so-called private companies, as we saw with Jack Ma, the richest guy the billionaire in China, overnight they decide, okay, you're going to disappear. You're going to go to a re-education camp. And Alibaba, which was his big firm, and Ant Capital, they're taken over. We've seen this with over 100 of the major CEOs and billionaires in China. Xi Jinping and the party have taken back control of them. Number 8 is equal liability of all to work. So establishment of industrial armies. So under the communist regime, you have a liability to work. We're going to take you and you're going to work wherever we tell you to do. And I remember one of my very dear friends, Vilnius Brzezinas, from Lithuania, he remembers he was just a very young child, 7 or 8, when his grandmother was taken away and sent off to a logging camp. Grandmother, in the snow, with other women in their dresses, off to a logging camp. And what are they going to do at a logging camp? They're out there in the woods. They didn't last very long. Number 9, combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of all the distinction between town and country, and a more equitable distribution of the populace over the country. We've seen this in every communist country. They just uproot people and move them over here, move them over there. In communist China, we have, in the past 20 years, these cities that didn't even exist that are now millions of people. A little fishing village, the government comes in and says, you're going to move over here. We're going to build a city. This is where you're going to be. And again, it's total control.
Right. Sit in the camera.
And finally, this is one of the most important ones, number 10, free education for all children in public schools.
So that sounds real familiar.
Yeah, it sounds very familiar. And of course, free means that the government's going to take the money from you, the worker, the taxpayer, and then they're going to decide how it is spent, and your kids will go there. The state will be in control of them.
The state will decide what they learn and
when they go to school, what they're going to be taught, and how they're going to be indoctrinated. And when you look at all 10 of these things and you realize how much of that has already been implemented all around the world, even in the non-communist countries and even here in the United States, it's a very sobering thing to realize that we are already far down the road in that regard.
I noticed, at least in these 10 planks, there wasn't any specific mention to the destruction of family. Where does that show up?
Well, we see it very...
But I mean, in the communist literature.
Yes, well, in the Communist Manifesto, right in the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx says, abolition of the family, exclamation mark, and he says, even the radical flare up at this. Do we really mean abolition of the family? Yes. And so he goes on about that in the Communist Manifesto, saying, what is the bourgeois family? It's just the exploitation of children by their parents. And then he goes on railing about that. The same with, he says, and people charge us with wanting to have a community of women, having our women in common. He says, but what is capitalism? Capitalism is the exploitation of the wife by the husband. And
right. Okay. So this is why some of the later communist revolutionaries then changed their tactics, because after all these continuous revolutions, they saw that the regular people weren't buying it anymore, and were becoming fearful. And wasn't it something like they recognized that the way they had to go with the Cultural Revolution, because the culture was based on the family.
Right. And so
the structure of society was mirroring the structure of the family. Even though if you destroy the family, then you can destroy the culture.
Right. They found over and over again that as repressive as they were, no matter how much murder and torture they carried out in persecution, that they still were not able to eradicate belief in God, and particularly Christianity. They found many of the same problems with the Muslims. And so they recognized very early on, Lenin did, that, look, this has to be a thorough overturning, which means we have to change hearts and minds. So we're going to have to penetrate into the various religions and communize the religions, and we're still going to eradicate many of them. We'll knock down a lot of the churches. But it's not going to be just a total wholesale attack on the religion. So this is where there was a argument among the communist leadership about whether on how much to try to infiltrate the religious institutions, or how much to just go full bore eradicating them. And so the League for Militant Atheism in Russia was all for just going full bore and executing as many priests and bishops and nuns as was necessary. But other communist leadership, I believe it was Tukhachevsky, said, no, we have to kind of work through this. We don't want to stir up more opposition, so we're going to have to be more clever about this. And so that's what we see over and over again. There is this polarity between many of the communists, some wanting to go real ham-fisted, hammer and tongs, and others saying, no, we have to be a little bit more clever about this. Yeah. But you started talking about the changing of the culture, and that's where you get into the Antonio Gramsci.
Right. Yeah. Before we get into there, though, just briefly, communism and fascism are usually portrayed as being complete polar opposite extreme groups. communism being far left and fascism far right, as though they're completely different. But can you very briefly, how different are they? How similar are they? I mean, are they more similar or more different?
Those are good questions, and they're really apropos now, because what have we seen for the last several years, particularly as Trump was running and then as he won in 2016? We see Nazi, fascist, everyone who is opposed to the total takeover of our country is denounced as a fascist, as a Nazi.
I mean, Nazis are usually labeled as fascists, but Nazi itself means National Socialist.
Yes, Nazi stood for National Socialist German Workers' Party. And so they were socialists.
And Mussolini is fascist, and he was a socialist.
He was a socialist also. And so what we see with what's happening today. Oh, and by the way, in the Nazi Party, we had lots of communists who joined the Nazi Party and Nazis who joined the Communist Party. In fact, in the Nazi Party, they were known as beefsteak Nazis because they were brown on the outside. They had the brown shirts, but they were red on the inside. They were communists. So even though they fought amongst each other, just like the Bloods and the Crips do, they are really very similar. They call for centralized power. All of the socialists always call for that and work toward that. So if you look at the Nazi Party program, the Communist Manifesto we went over had 10 points. The Nazi program, as it was first enunciated by Hitler, had 25 points. And the first 3 or 4 of them primarily deal, I think the first 5 maybe, deal with German citizenship and only Germans and only those, and calls for restoration of those lands which Germany claimed from neighboring countries, those kinds of things. But then when you get into the nuts and bolts of the political economic agenda, it's for centralized power and control over virtually all the means of production, over health and health care, education, all of those things. In sum is very similar to the communist agenda.
Just a slightly different tactic then.
Well, yes. And the difference primarily between fascism, Nazism, and communism are that the fascist Nazi programs are not as totalitarian in that they recognize that if you leave private property in the hands of some corporations and some of the people, it's more productive, it's more efficient, people are not going to resent it as much. And whereas in the communist model, everything is owned and controlled by the state. And it has always produced a disaster in terms of production. Also, if you're going to be that totalitarian, it requires a much larger police state to monitor all of that. And so that's one of the distinguishing characteristics between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. I did a story on this probably 30, 40 years ago, so I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was in the KGB or NKVD in the Soviet Union was numerically 4 or 5, or it might have been 6 times as many secret police as they had in Nazi Germany, which means, okay, then everything is being watched, or in the Orwellian ever-present police state.
Well, and then I suppose, too, the Nazis perhaps had more, or at least with the Nazis, but I don't know, maybe with Mussolini, too, with those fascists, that was there a greater focus on nationalism, the national identity?
Yeah, so particularly in the German, primarily in the German. The Italians were not as race conscious as the German Nazi regime.
Okay.
So yeah, so that was a very big part of it.
Yeah, so you mentioned Antonio Gramsci and George Lukács. Who were they, and what was the Frankfurt School, and how did they modify the Marxist-Leninist ideas of communism?
So
And their
Antonio
tactics.
Gramsci was an Italian communist, a member of the Communist Party in Italy. He's most famous for going to prison and writing his prison notebooks, which became the secular Bible of many of the cultural revolutionists of the 20th century. We'll jump back to him in a moment, but you mentioned Georg Lukács. He came here from Hungary. He was a communist, one of the worst kind of communists. He was a commissar under Bela Kun in the early revolution in in Hungary at that time. And Bela Kun was one of the most vicious of the early communist revolutionaries in the satellite countries. He established murder trains, which put their secret police on these trains, and they'd just go into town and come out and start killing everybody, torturing everybody.
Now, both of these figures were around the World War I
Correct.
time period, correct? And yeah,
Right. World War One and the Bolshevik Revolution time. Lukács came. So he was a hardcore communist. Participated in all of those terrible things, the Bela Kun regime. But then he and others formed the Frankfurt School. He came here to the United States, and
the Frankfurt School was.
the Frankfurt School.
What was the official name? Because it was part of the University of Frankfurt, right?
Right. It's at the University of Frankfurt. It was the
Institute of
Social Research.
Yeah.
And they were focused more on, okay, how do we change the way people think and the way they conceive ideas and how they perceive culture. And so we saw Max Horkheimer and Lukács and Adorno and others who became, when I was in college, Lukács was not that well, had been kind of superseded. Theodor Adorno and Herbert Marcuse, who became the big gurus of the day, and you were required to read them at some point in your college career, and they were the big Frankfurt School Marxist gurus of the day, and they have had a huge influence throughout, even though the names of many of the Frankfurt School disciples are not generally known by the average person. Just about everything you read today, and all of the people who run our university and college, feminist studies, black studies, Hispanic studies, trans studies, LGBT studies, all of the revolutionaries that are causing all the problem that you see today are huge disciples of the Frankfurt School. You change the culture, and politics and everything else follows.
Right. I guess because they realized from the past, over the 150 years prior, all these physical revolutions weren't working too well, and the people weren't going along with it, that they were being forced into it. So I guess they probably took up the tactic of Sun Tzu, right? Who said the greatest way to win a battle is without having to fight. And
so if you can, and so central to this was really and is destroying Christian civilization. Mm-hmm. So you have to destroy the whole idea of truth, that there is an objective truth. And so that's why you run into people all the time. Well, who can say whether it's right or wrong?
Yeah. That's true for you, but not true for me.
That's your truth. That's not my truth, you know. And so, so we see the Nietzschean supremacy of beyond good and evil, where, you know, who really knows what's good or evil anymore? And so basically anything can be justified. And if you have people that reject objective truth, then, you know, as G.K. Chesterton said, it's not that they will believe in nothing, but they can believe in anything. And yeah. So that's why we see the craziness all around us, where people say that, well, what is a woman? You know, a man can be a woman, and a woman can be a man, and
men can get pregnant, and
men can get pregnant, and so the people that are telling us that trust the science, then turn right around and tell us all this inane and insane.
Biology professor is fired from the university for teaching biology because students are complaining that he's teaching biology.
Right, and
real quick, is this camera still recording? Is it red light on?
I can't tell if the red light's on or if that's the light reflecting off of it.
Yeah, it's still recording. Okay.
And we see it in the Frankfurt School is primarily associated with critical theory. And today, most people are familiar with critical race theory.
Right.
And it has been percolating in the colleges for quite some time, but it broke out during the George Floyd riots as Black Lives Matter. And it's a very good example to show how these things incubate, and then all of a sudden, when the parameters are set up, it bursts out in a major eruption, a major plague. And the 3 black lesbian women who organized Black Lives Matter, Opal Tomeli and Alicia Garza, and the other gal's name is escaping me now. They actually all say that they were trained Marxists, and that not just trained Marxists, but they are trained LGBTQ activist Marxists. They've said they want to destroy the bourgeois family. Mm-hmm. And so who trained them? Well, the guy who trained them was Eric Mann. And Eric Mann, M-A-N-N, runs this activist organization, labor organization in Los Angeles. He was a communist member of the SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, back in the 1960s. He's still around, and now he runs this center. He trains all these new activists. And so in critical theory and these things. So we see how something which a few years ago people would have said was rather inconsequential. But when you put these activists together with a whole bunch of funding from a bunch of corporations that are globalist corporations, from the World Economic Forum, and foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation, the Soros Foundations, Ford Foundations, whatnot, all of a sudden they can create cadres all over the place and create not just national but global riots all over. And that's what we saw running for over a year here in this.
Yeah, you mentioned Herbert Marcuse. So to my understanding, the Frankfurt School was instituted there in Frankfurt, Germany, but they were all, or mostly all of them, were all Jewish. And then when the Nazi uprising came about, well, they had to flee, and then they eventually ended up in New York. But then after the war, many of them went back to Germany, but a couple of them, Herbert Marcuse primarily, decided to stay and work in the States. What were some of the things that he really pushed? I mean, I think one thing I remember is the primary targets for pushing this Marxist ideology. He sought out primarily blacks, students, feminist women, and homosexuals to lead the revolution. What were some of the tactics that he tried to employ?
Well, first of all, he took, particularly with blacks and other minorities, grievances, both real and exaggerated. And so at that time, there were still the residue of Jim Crow laws in various parts of the country in the South, where blacks were not allowed in certain institutions or whatnot. So he and others exploited that, not to remedy those things, because as subsequent events showed, he really wasn't caring about that. He didn't care about the people that were exploited in communist Vietnam, for instance, or other places. He championed the exploiters and the oppressors there. But he constantly wanted to have revolutions. So in all the universities where he taught, and he ended up at the University of San Diego because he got booted out of a couple of the other universities because of his radicalism. His objective was always to agitate and stir things up, just like Saul Alinsky. And so he was the most active of the agitators among the Frankfurt School. The others preferred to stay pretty much in academic environments and just write about things, but he became really the first Frankfurt School disciple to actually go out there and be in all the media and actually go to demonstrations and riots and urge them on.
Yeah, he was you mentioned in the universities, and I think they started off in Columbia University, right? That was something that Antonio Gramsci really promoted too. He called it the Long March to the Institutions, yes. Overtaking the educational systems, and media and entertainment.
Probably the best source for most people to read on Gramsci is Carl Bogg's book on Gramsci, on the two revolutions, because Gramsci is pretty dense reading and whatnot, but Boggs kind of breaks it all down and gets it more assimilatable.
I don't know how much of this is attributable to Marcuse, but a certain author, Timothy Matthews, gives a kind of summarization of a lot of the tactics of the Frankfurt School. Here being there being 11. One, create racism offenses. I think that we could see that in critical race theory. Two, foster continual change to create confusion. Three, teach sex ed and homosexuality to children. 4, undermine schools and teachers' authority. 5, facilitate huge immigration to destroy identity. 6, promote excessive drinking. 7, empty the churches. 8, create an unreliable legal system with bias against victims of crimes. 9, foster dependency on the state and state benefits. 10, control and dumb down media and education. 11, break down the family. And of course, I think that's where Marcuse had a lot of influence. Probably, I imagine he had a lot of influence in the sexual revolution, because a lot of the tactics for breaking down the family include pornography, fornication, adultery, contraception, divorce, etc. And I think that was something that he really promoted too, was sexual license and homosexuality and whatnot.
That was a big thing in the 60s, was 60s and 70s, was sexual revolution, and he was one of the apostles of that, giving it a veneer of intellectual heft with all of his critical theory, but of course there were many others that were promoting it too. We had Saul Gordon and Lester Kirkendall and many other of the psychology sexual revolutionists that were pushing it, that worked hand in hand with him. When it comes to the homosexual revolution, we see a very clear Marxist-Leninist communist connection. Harry Hay was the founder of the Mattachine Society, which was the first early group, militant group of homosexuals. And Harry Hay and several of his Communist Party comrades were the ones that organized that. And
this camera.
And recently, Bettina Aptheker, who is a professor at the University of California, San Jose State, she is a longtime Communist Party member, the daughter of Herbert Aptheker, who was the theoretician of the Communist Party. Bettina Aptheker wrote a book just recently called Coming Out of the or Communism in the Closets, or something like, I think that's the title of it. Anyway, in which she goes through the whole history of which the Communist Party worked in the homosexual movement and exploited that. Her father, Herbert Aptheker, she wrote in an earlier book, sexually molested her. She went on to become one of the main feminist lesbian authors, along with Angela Davis, who is also a professor at the same university. They were lesbian lovers together. Angela Davis was, of course, the Black Panther revolutionary communist leader and vice presidential candidate on the Communist Party ticket under Gus Hall. So there is a very clear connection between the communists, the Marxist-Leninists, the Frankfurt School, etc., on pushing all of these key wedge issues that are aimed at creating cleavages within society and particularly destroying morality in the family.
I think that's something an important to mention, is the importance of modesty, especially among women, modesty of dress and behavior. For one, it's just something that Our Lady of Fatima, Our Lady of Quito, Ecuador, Our Lady of, was a good success? Warned about back in the 1600s, speaking specifically about the 20th century, that there would be a loss of customs, a loss of morals, and speaking about the degradation of modesty. And of course, if women are not dressing modestly, and we can look at, how from the early 1900s till now, how it's continually gotten worse and worse and worse. And I know so many really, really wonderful Catholic women, whether they're traditional of a sort or doesn't matter, who take their faith seriously but still dress immodestly. And I'm not passing any judgment on them, but I have to just assume that they are unaware of the importance of it. And for one, it can be, not in all cases, but in some cases it can be sinful, even mortally sinful, depending on how the dress is, and of course then there's also modesty of behavior. But it also, I mean, it's kind of a gateway. You know, they speak of gateway drugs, but I mean, modesty is kind of a gateway sin or thing that easily leads to, especially among men, impure thoughts, which of course are mortally sinful if given full, acceptance to them. But then pornography, fornication, adultery, contraception, abortion, all these things, can lead to that. So I mean, true modesty among women is kind of a really important protective barrier against all those other abominations. I think it's very important for women to consider that and be aware of that.
To be aware of that,
and it's something that the communists really love and cherish is that immodesty that
sure,
it's part of their whole tactic.
They want to destroy all Christian morality, and if you can have unbridled lust, unbridled sexual conduct, and many of them said Marcuse advocated for pansexuality, basically everything, so that's supposedly the great liberation.
Yeah.
Well, it isn't. It is an enslavement. If you are not in control of your own passions, then you're enslaved by them.
Right.
And that's what they want, because they know that for a nation to be strong, for a community, for a society, for a civilization to be strong, it has to be moral, it has to show restraint, it has to show ability to sacrifice for one's loved ones, family, and you can't do that if you're just indulging all of your sensual desires.
Yeah. We're approaching the end here. Just got a few more questions here. We've been looking a lot at the communism in the West and Russia. How was communism in China, Mao Zedong especially, how was that communist revolution different from Lenin and Stalin's revolution and just communism in general in the West? And how was it that in China they were able to implement it so rapidly and so effectively?
Well, so the communists, Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, Chu Te, and the other communist revolutionaries were trained and supplied by Russia. And Stalin sent Borodin into Russia to help them. And that they would have never succeeded there because they had adamantine opposition from the nationalists, Kuomintang, under Chiang Kai-shek, who was a Christian, a rarity in China, who was a Christian, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. And he had fought to unify China, and at the same time was fighting the Japanese who had invaded China. And at the same time, Stalin's forces were going in there to undermine him. They wanted to turn China communist. They would not have succeeded. And in fact, Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang forces defeated the communists time after time after time. It wasn't until Stalin's agents in the United States, with the help of their globalist allies here in the United States, cut the feet out from under Chiang Kai-shek. And he was fighting the Japanese. After 1941, after Pearl Harbor, we were fighting the Japanese as well. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was our president. He had his New Deal administration thoroughly honeycombed with Soviet agents. The Ware Cell, the Silver Master Cell, all of these people, including the ones who defected, like Whittaker Chambers, Elizabeth Bentley, who exposed these hate-amassing, Nathaniel Whale, who exposed the communist infiltration of the federal government. And one of the main things that they exposed, besides the penetration of our Manhattan Project, the atom bomb project, was the way in which top-level people in our government, their agents, were undermining Chiang Kai-shek and helping Mao Zedong and the communists in China over and over again. And so really what happened is that Alger Hiss, Harry Dexter White, Lachlan Curry, and General Donovan and others in our government were destroying our allies over there and allowing the communists to take over. And we've written about that quite extensively. There have been very excellent books written on that, like How the Far East Was Lost by Professor Anthony Kubek. And if it hadn't been for a betrayal in our own government of our allies, China never would have gone communist. And then once in 1949, the communists took over and began all of the mass murder and destruction, complete destruction of the history and culture and family structure and whatnot of China. It was a total failure, and China was a complete basket case economically. They would not have even survived to today if it hadn't been for the massive transfers of technology, of capital, of know-how and expertise from the United States. And much of that was
because there were so many Soviets, communists working within the U.S. government.
Within the U.S. government, and then, but here's where it becomes more difficult to just look at it and say it was easier to say when it was communists like Alger Hiss. He was proven to be an actual Soviet agent. Harry Dexter White, Virginia's Frank Coe, Nathan Gregory Silvermaster. These were all actual Soviet agents. But here's where we get to today. It becomes very obvious that we have what we call the globalist communist axis, where we see the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, Bill Gates, Richard Branson, all these top billionaires, Ray Dalio, Jamie Dimon of Citibank, or J.P. Morgan Chase, Lawrence Fink of BlackRock. Here, these are some of the richest men in the world. They're going over and clinking champagne glasses for the last couple of decades with Xi Jinping and his predecessors, setting up all these huge industrial plants and manufacturing and research and development plants in communist China, which they could have never done on their own. And all of that was really started in train back in 1971 when Henry Kissinger went over there as an agent for David Rockefeller. He worked for David Rockefeller and Nelson Rockefeller. At the time, he was National Security Advisor to President Richard Nixon. But he started the transfer of all of this massive wealth to China. And in 1973, David Rockefeller himself went over there. Here he was. David Rockefeller was the chairman of the Chase Manhattan Bank, the chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations, the chairman of the Trilateral Commission. And he went over to China, met with Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, the premier and vice premier of China. And he comes back and pens an op-ed for the New York Times called Notes from a China Traveler. And he says he was struck by the harmony and dedication of the people in China. And he said, Chairman Mao has accomplished one of the most successful revolutions in all of history. And he went on, rhapsodizing about this. So
Yeah, and how many did he kill in a genocide?
Well, over 40 million. By some counts, it's over 60 million. So, I mean, by any...
What a wonderful, beautiful revolution.
And this was not just being lined up and shot. That would be bad enough. This was every kind of torture imaginable.
Famine and starvation.
Yes, and then, in addition to that, the utter depravity and the destitution that all these people were left in was just incredible. Except, of course, the party leaders, they're whining and dining the whole time. They didn't suffer any of the same privations that the general populace did. So China has thrived, and now we see just this year an extraordinary series of summits by, for instance, the Trilateral Commission had a big summit in which they called for expansion of trade with China. And they called it this year, in fact, I've just written a story on that. It's in our current issue of the magazine. They called 2023 year zero of the New World Order. That's a very ominous
Say that
thing.
again.
Excuse me, not year zero. They called 2023 year one of the New World Order. That's, in my mind, a very conscious appeal to the French Revolution, and that they view this year, 2023, as the opening year in their new calendar of this New World Order.
And where was this stated and unveiled at?
So this was reported in the Nikkei Asia, which is the major Japanese newspaper. So the Trilateral Commission is composed of the uber wealthy, uber powerful people of Asia, primarily Japan and China, Europe, and North America. So there's just a little over 400 members. So you take the top strata of banking, media, etc., big tech, big pharma, etc., and that's the Trilateral Commission. At the same time, just following up on that, the World Economic Forum, and the president of the World Economic Forum is a member of the Trilateral Commission. They had a big meeting in Tianjin, China, called their annual meeting of the new champions. And Li Keqiang, the vice premier of China, was their keynote speaker. Klaus Schwab and all the other bigwigs were there. They do this every year in China for the last 14 years. And this is to intertwine all the big corporations of China with all these other corporations of the United States, Europe, Latin America, etc., and to begin implementing a Chinification program that has already been developing over the past several decades, in which we become more and more like China. They want to implement here, the Trilateral Commission, the World Economic Forum has called for it, the CBDC, Central Bank Digital Currency. So it takes the Communist Manifesto one step further to where you have a global central bank with digital currency, which means that we can create or destroy whatever savings or...
Yeah, if you're not going along with the party line, if you're not doing what we say, we'll cut off your funding. You won't be able to buy anything. You won't have anything.
And control over all AI. They want to have AI used for surveillance and censorship.
Also those 15-minute cities too. I mean,
right. So because this is where management by crisis is so important. We have the pandemic or plandemic. We also have climate catastrophe. Now President Biden declared a climate emergency.
Yeah.
And so if we have a climate emergency, that means that we have to take extraordinary measures like climate lockdowns. And so 15-minute cities means that, okay, you can't go any further than 15 minutes away from your...
You'll have everything you need within 15-minute walking distance from you, so you won't need cars, so we can get rid of cars. And so you'll just walk away. Isn't that sounds so nice, but then, for instance, like...
That's right out of the Communist Manifesto, which is centralization of transportation and everything. In
So I was just recently informed about the project going on in Arabia, the Line, which is just one project among others. But this idea, okay, well, in order to save land space, we'll just build a city in a straight line and build it up, and you'll have everything you need within a 15-minute walking distance. All that just sounds so nice. Well, guess what? You're in the middle of a desert, for one, and you're in the straight line, so there's only 2 points of in and out. And of course, who's calling for these 15-minute cities? The World Economic Forum, China, and so when the next lockdown comes, well, that's going to be real easy to control the people who are living in that line. You just blockade one end and blockade the other, and it's higher than the Empire State Building, so good luck trying to get out. And then what happens to your food and water? Well, you only get what's given to you.
Well, we saw that.
And then real easy to control people and, force them to get jabs and things like that. Well,
we saw that in Shanghai and in Wuhan and whatnot, where people were, in some cases, actually welded into their buildings. And people were jumping off their balconies and out of their windows to their death because of it. So that is this is where in the last few years a lot of people have really gotten the wake-up call when they see that Klaus Schwab and Yuval Harari and many of these World Economic Forum people that are advocating that no, you can't have cars, can't have
no private property.
You're going to have to eat bugs.
Yeah.
No more meat. No more dairy. You're just going to have bugs and plants. Well, of course, they're jet setting all over the globe. One of the big ones at the World Economic Forum and the United Nations and the climate things is our Leonardo DiCaprio. He has his own private island where he spent hundreds of millions of dollars building it into this luxurious place for other environmentalists to fly into and learn about the environment. But that's the hypocrisy that we're dealing with, and we always see this. It's synonymous with dictatorship, and particularly communist dictatorship, where you have, in Russia, they were known as the nomenklatura. They were the upper echelons of the Communist Party. They had access to all of the luxury goods, etc., that the proletariat they supposedly worked for could only dream about. And the same in China, where the princelings, those who are Communist Party officials and their children, get all the royal treatment, and the rest of the people are given only what the party says they can have.
North Korea.
Yeah.
So again, approaching the end, I don't know how much you mentioned it earlier. Maybe just briefly, the aspect of infiltration and subversion into the church, and figures like Bella Dodd, Manning Johnson. Don't want to go too much into that. That could be just an entire whole other episode just on that. But
right. We have had many people who have, over the years, come out of the Communist Party, various Communist parties, and many of whom were dedicated communists for a long time. You mentioned Dr. Bella Dodd. She wrote a book, School of Darkness. That was a very eye-opening book to me, many years ago, and now it is available in several different new reprintings. She left the Communist Party, and it's a very eye-opening, harrowing account of what she encountered there. But she became a Catholic. She became a Christian.
Yeah, Archbishop Fulton Sheen catechized and brought her into the church.
He was also instrumental in the case of Elizabeth Bentley. Elizabeth Bentley was a top Soviet agent. Another one was Louis Boudin's. He was the editor of the communist newspaper, the Daily World, and editor of several other of their newspapers. And he was a top member in the top echelon of the Communist Party.
Now they defected around the time of the 40s and 50s, right?
Right. This is most of them in the 50s. So,
and she, at least Bella Dodd, testified before Congress, correct?
She did. Elizabeth Bentley testified many times. Whittaker Chambers did many times. So did Louis Boudin's. Whittaker Chambers was one of the most famous of the converts. He did not convert to Catholicism, but he said, he recognized, he said, the only institution, he saw how vast was the conspiracy that he was involved with. He was very pessimistic. He says, I don't see any opposition to it. The only opposition in this world that we can have any hope in is the Catholic Church. He'd convert to the Catholic Church, but he said at that time, he didn't see any other institution that had a chance.
And yet, I don't know if he was, but at least Bella Dodd was involved of infiltrating communists into the Catholic Church.
Yes, so she said that she had, while she was in the Communist Party, had helped put hundreds of communists into the Catholic.
I think even thousands into the seminaries. And
yeah, it's been questioned. I think Paul Kenger was trying to track that down and wasn't able to verify it.
But she has said that by the time she was testifying, that some of those figures that she had put into the seminaries were at that time had reached some of the highest levels in the church, which presumably would mean cardinals.
Right, and so more recently, Dr. Taylor Marshall has written this book, Infiltration,
right.
which is
and
very important.
Jack McManus.
Jack McManus has one, Deep Church Revealed. And Reverend Clarence Kelly, 35 years ago, wrote a book, a very important one, particularly on the Masonic and Illuminist infiltration of the church and of society, called Conspiracy Against God and Man. And there have been many others as well, going clear back to the papal encyclicals against church, against communism, by Monsignor Juin and by other priests who were given apostolic papal approbation for their writings exposing this, both the Masonic and particularly the Carbonari Alta Vendita efforts to infiltrate the church. So we know from our experience with the communist infiltration of our own government and of our society that they have been very successful at doing those kinds of things. And it's very obvious in what we see today in so much of the church, with the auto demolition of the church. And Pope Paul VI even said the smoke of Satan has entered the church. So we have definitely some very
well, and then there was also Pope Leo XIII's either vision or locution that he had, where he saw or heard the dialogue between God and Satan, where, like in the Old Testament case of Job, God granted Satan, 75 to 100 years to try to destroy the Catholic Church. I mean, of course, we don't know when that time period begins, but
so we've definitely seen a century of very destructive things going on in the world and particularly in the church since Vatican II, since the Vatican Council. And your correspondent who wrote into you about the liberation theology and whatnot, he didn't mention Dom Helder Camara, but Dom Helder Camara was known as the Red Archbishop of Brazil. And since we mentioned the Vatican II, he was the key player that put together the Pact of the Catacombs at Vatican II, where all these bishops went into the catacombs and signed this pact that really was a communist liberation theology pact, which has been playing out in the church ever since.
You mean kind of like an Alta Vedita thing, where they signed a pact, with a design to try to destroy the church from within, or
they didn't put it in those terms. The Pact of the Catacombs said we are going to create this church for the poor, and the terminology that they used was and of course Dom Helder Camara was the one who put it together. He was the Red Archbishop. He was one of the founders of the liberation theology movement, and very key. There is an interview on the World Economic Forum website where Klaus Schwab is being interviewed, and he says one of the most important people who influenced him was Dom Helder Camara. And he goes into that about...
Very interesting.
And that's why we see with the World Economic Forum and the Vatican coming together, working on these things like their stakeholder capitalism and inclusive capitalism, it is really state capitalism, which is what you have in communist countries, where the state owns all the capital and everything. And here are these big corporate...
Yeah, so you do have Catholics who say that capitalism is bad, but there's different types of capitalism.
Yes, so and that's a whole big...
Yeah, I mean, we don't need to get into that, but
the whole big topic. What papal teachings and Catholic social teachings have held is that what we generally refer to as capitalism, meaning the right to private property, to pursue your own business, not to have the government control all aspects of your economic life, that is supported by church teaching. What a lot of the more radical capitalist, laissez-faire people who object to that will say is, so, well, no, you can't have the state involved in any of that. We say, well, wait a second, the state is involved if we say that pornography is illegal, or that prostitution is illegal, or that certain drug activity is illegal, or whatnot. So we accept that there are areas where, or that right now there's a big push on for legalizing child sex exploitation.
Yeah.
And they call it, instead of calling pedophiles, we are going to be called minor attracted persons. And so we're attracted to children. And what's wrong with that? Children are sexual beings too. And so we recognize that, no, there is good reason for having laws against that. And so we don't recognize every form of commerce or every transaction as being legal and just and good. And so within a capitalist or free market system, there is room for discussion about how much the state, or rather the government, can be involved. But we recognize there is some, and that's where sometime we'll have to do a program on that, and Wilhelm Röpke and some of those things.
Real quick, what's this book?
Okay, so very important. This is called The Black Book on Communism. I'll let you hold it up there for the camera.
You got a camera on you too, but your camera's actually better.
Oh, okay. Well, here. That probably going to show it
Yeah.
there. Okay, the Black Book on Communism, Crimes, Terror, and Repression. There's a series of authors who put this together. Now it's been 20 years ago. But it's very important.
Published by Harvard University,
Yes,
right?
so, amazingly, yes. Unfortunately, Harvard wasn't publishing these things when it really mattered at the time when all the terror and repression were going on. They wait until after it's over, and then they say, "Oh yes, this is terrible." But these authors brought together testimony from all over the world, and we're in danger of losing whole generations, 2 generations now, that have no idea what really has happened under communist regimes. And this book gives public testimony to those things, those millions of victims, and all the torment and terror that they endured. And, you know, it's just like people are always saying about the Nazi Holocaust, you know, lest we forget. Well, we have to know about this because we're being told today that communism, we have at all of our colleges and universities, basically, Marxist or Marxist-Leninist occupied territory now. And open communism or occult communism in the form of critical race theory and whatnot is being taught in all of the schools. And so this is a very important addition to that. In 2007, I went to Lithuania for, it was basically a follow-up to this, Vilnius, Lithuania, and victims of communism from all over the world came there, from the Soviet gulags, from China, from Vietnam, from Mexico, from Cuba, and amazing. I was about the only journalist there, the only American journalist. New York Times, nobody else sent anyone there. They're not concerned about this. And I was able to interview people who had come from the Soviet Gulag, including one of their legislators who was born in the Gulag as a baby, and Monsignor Cervinkus, who survived the Gulag, but nobody else, none of the media was interested in talking to them. So we have to remember these things. If we don't, we're doomed to repeat them. And we can see it here in our own country, what's happening with the Antifa and Black Lives Matter, and now with what's being pushed in all of the schools, all this totalitarian agenda to completely indoctrinate our children in every kind of trans ideology, LGBTQ ideology. And most people don't realize that for the past 30 years, the People's History of the United States, written by Howard Zinn, who was a member of the Communist Party USA. That's where today we're getting all this critical race theory and hate America stuff. Howard Zinn has been, his book, People's History, is required reading in thousands of high schools and colleges, on PBS, A&E network. They've done all kinds of series on him. They have a whole Zinn education program that's being promoted by the National Education Association, and this is being put in all the schools, and it's total communist propaganda. So this isn't something just theoretical; it's actually practically.
I think a lot of people too probably don't realize how dangerous it can be, revealing. Exposing this kind of stuff, because I remember one instance in particular when you were investigating the Oklahoma City bombing. You were traveling a lot, going over there investigating. You were probably the most in-depth investigator there, one of the only ones really doing any real digging, and you had to have bodyguards, right?
Yes.
And then you had to be careful about the bodyguards you chose to make sure they wouldn't sell out on you. And then you're getting, during that investigation, with everything that you were revealing, you were getting all kinds of death threats, and not just to you, but also to us, to the whole family. I forget how old I was at that time, but when was that?
So
96?
Well, it went on for 5 years, from 95 through 1980.
Yeah, so in 96, I would have been 10. But I remember one time, maybe it was a time when we were on a road trip, but I remember you telling us, hey, you guys, my brother and I have one brother. I remember you telling us, I don't want to, scare you guys or anything, but you have to be aware of the reality that getting a lot of death threats, and they're also threatening all of you. And so, if ever you're outside playing or anything, and you see, suspicious characters like this or whatever, don't approach them, don't listen to them if they try to entice you, whatever. If you happen to see a red dot suddenly appear on you, don't stop and look and see where it's coming from. Just, get behind something, get away, and that was a real threat. That was something we were really dealing with. And, that was just one instance of the things that you were uncovering. And that's what happens when you start, when you start shedding light on the darkness. They don't like it, and they start retaliating.
And many, I had the experience, unfortunately, of many people who I was working with or had become whistleblowers or who were defectors who were murdered. And that's why I really applaud Jim Caviezel and Tim Ballard and all the people that are exposing the child sex slavery racket and the pedophile networks of the powerful, because they know that they are facing very real possible retribution.
So to wrap up, what do we do? What can we do? There's a lot of Catholics who will say, oh, it's too late. There's nothing we can do at this point other than just, pray and do penance. I mean, the problem with our country and the world is sin, not politics. So, we should try to fix things. We should not try to fix things with politics, but just pray and do penance. Others will say, our country was doomed from the beginning because it wasn't established as an official Catholic country, and it contains some heretical beliefs in its constitution. The voting system is so corrupt now that it makes no difference. Your votes don't count, so why even bother? The country is doomed to collapse. Why keep kicking the can down the road? Why not just let it collapse and let God take care of it? Basically, resistance is futile. The only thing we can and should do is just pray and do penance. Well, is that it? Is that all we should be doing? I mean, that's obvious. That's obviously like first and foremost is prayer and penance, but is that all that it boils down to?
Very good question. It's something that I've had to deal with over and over again over the decades. First of all, we do live in this temporal order, in this temporal material world. We are not.
Yeah, we're not just spirits like the angels. We're body and soul.
Right, and we are supposed to occupy until he comes. That's what he says, occupy until I come. So when we occupy, that doesn't mean that we just placidly, passively occupy. We are supposed to be upholding and building the kingdom of Christ the King. And
church militant.
We are supposed to be, yes, the church militant. And to me, for people who say, no, it's too late, they've given up hope. And so it's a sin, really, against hope. We are supposed to hope that our Lord and trust that our Lord is going to provide us with whatever graces we need. And we don't know the timetable that God has for us. So when I say, when people, I've had this happen many times. People say, "Well, it's too late. I'm just going to go to church and pray about it." But then I've had them call me and say, "Oh, the Child Protective Services are taking my children. We got to organize some people to do it?" Or they say they live in an area where the government has declared that their area is a wetland, and so they're going to lose their farm.
Or look at the inflation of the economy and the gas prices going up and complaining about that. And
right, and so but when that happens, then they don't just say, "I'm going to pray about it." They say, "We got to do something."
yeah,
If your house is on fire, which we have experienced, yes, we prayed about it, but we also called the fire department and we started fighting the fire until they got here. And if your child is out playing outside and you see him out in the street, you don't just say, "Oh, holy guardian angel, take care of my child who's playing dangerously in the street."
Yeah.
No, we have practical things that we have to do. And yes, it is daunting when you look at all that we see around us and the way in which evil has permeated and penetrated and marinated our whole culture. And so, absolutely, we need prayer, we need penance, we need fasting. But then we also need to ask our Lord, "What can I do? What would you have me do?" And each of us can do practical things.
Yeah, I think when it comes to the church, it's not an institute. It's not an institution that was, started by man. There's a real hierarchy there, and that the lay person can't do a whole lot in regards to the church more than prayer and penance. I mean, you can write letters to your bishop, hopefully kind letters, encouraging them to embrace the true faith and things like that. But there's not a lot that a lay person can do in matters of the church. But when it comes to government, if we don't have a monarchy, which monarchies don't really exist anymore, we've been born into a country that has a system of government, whether for better or for worse, allows the people to have a voice. And so for me, what I see is like when evil men, whether they realize it or not, are working ultimately for Satan, are trying to implement their satanic agendas using politics and economics as their tools, as their battlegrounds, to ultimately try to impose this communism, this agenda from hell. To me, it seems that's where the battleground is, and we have an ability to engage in that battle. Not so much in the church. We have the ability to really do something there. We have to me, I think we have an obligation to do that.
Absolutely. The popes tell us that we have an obligation to participate in the political process. And so,
but wait, your votes don't matter anymore. So what use is it?
Well, people will use that excuse. And to me, it is an excuse to give up and not do anything. Part of it is laziness. Part of it is a sense of hopelessness. And if it's a sense of hopelessness, then you got to get back on your knees because God will give you the grace. We've seen many people who have, throughout history, who have been faced with as great odds. Just recently, one of my colleagues mentioned Pelayo in Asturias, in Spain. And you could say he had a much more hopeless situation than we do. He was the smallest kingdom in Spain. All the rest of Spain had been taken over by the Muslims. All of the Christians had either caved in or betrayed him, and his own Bishop Opus, comes out and tells Pelayo, come down, these are okay people, And they could have given up. He didn't. And they prayed, and they had special intervention from heaven on a couple occasions, but they still had to go out there and they had to really fight. We're not called to right now pick up a sword and physically fight, but we are called to get out there and fight. If you're not objecting to men dressed up as women going into your daughters and your wives' restrooms, then what kind of a man
libraries
are you?
And
yeah. And that they're going to have drag queen story hour in your library that your taxes are paying for, and you're not going to do anything about it, then what kind of Christian are you? You're not standing up for what is right. So it's a difficult call. What are you going to do? There are people who are just political activists who think they're going to change all of this with politics by getting conservatives together and doing things. It's not an either or zero-sum game. We have to do all of those things.
Yeah, the either or is that false dichotomy. It's both.
Right. So we're called, obviously, as Christians, we put our faith in God. So we're gonna pray. We're gonna sanctify our own lives by yielding to God's graces and becoming more pleasing to Him. As we do that, He will give us whatever strength we need, whatever wisdom we need, whatever courage we need to do the right thing. But there are things that we can be doing. We can be linking arms with other people, even those, they don't even have to be Catholic or traditional Catholic, because that is a very peculiar way of thinking of things. If we're joining hands with other people there and they see the joy and the strength of Christ in us, we're going to win converts to the church. And not only from those who are outside of the church, but those who are inside of the church. We need many of our priests and bishops who are too timid right now. They will, with our prayers and with our example, will begin taking up their positions as shepherds and start acting like shepherds. Kind
of one final thought I had in regard to the attitude that some have of, why keep kicking the can down the road? Just let things, fall apart, let God wipe it up, and it's just the evil powers that be have too much control. The voting systems doesn't work anymore. There's nothing you can do. Basically, just give up. Not I suppose not intrinsically, but it could be a sin, as you mentioned, a sin against hope. But it could also be a sin of accomplice, because there's 9 ways of being an accomplice to sin, one of which is by silence, or by not doing anything. So, for example, I don't know, say I see somebody is going to kill somebody else. Well, I have to make a judgment call. One, do I intervene or do I not? If I intervene, is there reasonable hope that my intervention will, save that person's life? If there's not any reasonable hope, then you're not obliged to intervene. But if there is some reasonable hope that your intervention will save that person's life, then you would be obliged to do so. So I guess it boils down, in that instance, it would boil down to an individual's judgment call, whether they truly, honestly believe that there's nothing that they can do to stop any of this, which I don't believe, is the case. I mean, you mentioned some of the historical things. Look at the Old Testament with Gideon and the Maccabees and King David himself before he was king. All these stories in the Old Testament where they're vastly, vastly outnumbered. I mean, like 300 Spartan type outnumbered, 300 men to 100,000, or more. And, I remember specifically in the Maccabees where they're hugely outnumbered. And yet, Jonathan Maccabees, he was the leader, right? Jonathan, I'm thinking David. Judas Maccabeus tells them, okay, we're going to go fight this huge army. We are so incredibly vastly outnumbered, like it's just insanity to try to fight them. There's no way we can possibly win this. But to make it even more clear that we're not the ones winning this fight, we're going to fast before we go into battle. Fast to the point that in the scripture it says that they're almost on the verge of fainting as they go into battle. And the whole, well, maybe not the whole point, but a large part of the point of that is we are not winning this battle. God's winning this battle, but we still have to go out and fight. I think it was Father Terra also said, he made the analogy that, we go to plant a garden. We don't just, kneel down and pray and say, oh God, please give me a bountiful harvest. We have to pray for that. But then we also have to go out and till the ground, plant the seeds, water it, harvest it. We still have to do the work.
Gotta weed it, gotta do all the things.
You don't just kneel down and pray and say, give me a good harvest. You still go out and do it. And of course, in the Psalms, David, so over and over and over again, the confidence he has, it doesn't matter if I have 10,000 enemies surrounding me. I have confidence that God will give me victory. So this attitude that, there's nothing we can do I think is just, like you said, it's just a loss of hope. And
well, also it can be laziness.
Yeah, it can be that
too. Sloth. People, look, if you're going out and you're bowling and you're hunting and you're fishing, you're canoeing and you're golfing and you're playing soccer and you're doing all other kinds of entertainment, going to the movies and whatnot, then you really don't have any excuse for not doing. Those are all worldly things, and they are not bad in and of themselves. Some of them are positive goods. However, there is a proportionality and priority in things. And if your child is being kidnapped, you don't say, okay, well, let's go to the movies. Mm-hmm. And that's what we see happening here. We have too many of the people who should be on the front lines, who should be at the abortion clinics praying, or at their legislatures stopping them from carrying out this slaughter. They're too busy doing all these other worldly things. And I believe we're going to be judged on that. Yeah. Where were you when my children were being slaughtered? Where were you when all this obscenity was being pushed out?
That reminds me of the great line from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, where Frodo says, oh, I wish none of this had ever happened. And of course, Gandalf's line is, so do all who live to see such times. But that's not for us to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. It's a fantastic line. So I'd like to just kind of wrap up here with a few more quotations from some of these encyclicals I mentioned earlier, but these extracts are from these various popes kind of giving their encouragement and directives to the fellow bishops and to the faithful, encouraging them to fight. So here's from Pius IX, quote, "For since you, venerable brethren, have been called to share a portion of our care," here obviously he's talking to the bishops here, "strive to fulfill your ministry with attentiveness and zeal, and to fight the good fight." He doesn't say just give up, it's not worth fighting. "You must fight energetically, since you know very well what great wounds the undefiled spouse of Jesus Christ has suffered, and how vigorous is the destructive attack of her enemies." End quote. That's Pius IX from his encyclical Qui Pluribus, 1846. Pius XI, quote, "To ward off such great evils from human society, nothing therefore is to be left untried. To this end may all our labors turn, to this all our energies, to this our fervent and unremitting prayers to God. For with the assistance of divine grace, the fate of the human family rests in our hands. Therefore let all men of good will stand united, all who wish to fight this good and peaceful battle of Christ, and under the leadership and teaching guidance of the Church, let all strive according to the talent, powers, and position of each to contribute something to the Christian reconstruction of human society." End quote. Pius XI, 40º Anno, 1931. So here he's saying is like everyone, not just bishops, not just priests, everyone, each person has something that they can contribute, some way that they can fight. Others can do more than others can do less than others, but everyone has something that they can contribute to the fight. He goes on in another encyclical. He continues in this other encyclical, quote, "We cherish the firm hope that the fanaticism with which the sons of darkness work day and night at their materialistic and atheistic propaganda will at least serve the holy purpose of stimulating the sons of light to a like and even greater zeal for the honor of the divine majesty. The fundamental remedy today lies in a sincere renewal of private and public life according to the principles of the gospel," and then he mentions later especially, "detachment from earthly goods and the precept of charity, which includes the spiritual and corporal works of mercy." And I think one could, aside from the official ones on the list of spiritual and corporal works of mercy, we can also see an extension of that by, if our fellow neighbors, charity, the law of charity is love of God above all things, but then love of neighbor, and neighbor, not your next door neighbor, but everyone around you.
All the human family.
And so in this case, if we look at our neighbors of our state, of our country, are under this vicious attack by these evil minions working for Satan, do we just sit back and say, I'm not going to do anything? That would see it being a sin against the corporal works of mercy, against charity. In this renewal, the Catholic press should supply accurate and complete information on the activity of the enemy and the means of resistance which have been found most effective in various quarters. It should offer useful suggestions and warn against the insidious deceits with which communists endeavor all too successfully to attract even men of good faith. And so with that paragraph, I kind of hope the work that my dad does and that what I'm doing here with this channel, with this episode in particular, that hopefully what we're doing is what Pius XI here is asking us to be doing. Supply accurate and complete information on the activity of the enemy and means of resistance which have been found most effective in various quarters. It should offer useful suggestions and warn against the insidious deceits with which communists endeavor to attract even men of good faith. See to it, venerable brethren, that the faithful do not allow themselves to be deceived. Communism is intrinsically wrong, and no one who would save Christian civilization may collaborate with it in any undertaking whatsoever. And so, as a final and most efficacious remedy, we recommend, venerable brethren, that in your dioceses you use the most practical means to foster and intensify the spirit of prayer joined with Christian penance. We extend our paternal invitation to our beloved sons among the laity who are doing battle in the ranks of Catholic action. This task of formation, now more urgent and indispensable than ever, which must always precede direct action in the field, will assuredly be served by study circles, conferences, lecture courses, and the various other activities undertaken with a view to making known the Christian solution of the social problem. I think this is something that should probably be revived.
Absolutely.
Catholic action must organize information on a large scale to disseminate knowledge of the fundamental principles on which, according to the pontifical documents, a Christian social order must build. To all our children, finally, of every rank and every nation, to every religious and lay organization in the Church who still believe in God and pay Him homage, may take a decisive part. Such is the positive task of resisting unto victory the attacks of communism. This means that all diligence should be exercised by states, and here I think we could also, in a certain sense, substitute states for Catholic men, to prevent within their territories the ravages of an anti-God campaign which shakes society to its very foundations. At the same time, the state must allow the Church full liberty to fulfill her divine and spiritual mission, and this in itself will be an effectual contribution to the rescue of nations from the dread torment of the present hour. Like you were saying earlier, that defector said, the only hope I can see is the Catholic Church. Everywhere today there is an anxious appeal to moral and spiritual forces, and rightly so. For the evil we must combat, socialism and communism, is at its origin primarily an evil of the spiritual order. Again, primary thing is prayer and penance, but it goes beyond that, because the means in which they are seeking to achieve this communism is through politics and economics and whatnot, and so that's their battleground. We can't, as laymen, we can't really fight the battle in the church, but we can fight in that arena.
Right. We can't cede those battlegrounds to them.
You can't just let them have it. That would ultimately just be a sin, just giving it up to them. From this polluted source, the monstrous emanations of the communistic system flow with satanic logic. Now, the Catholic Church is undoubtedly preeminent among the moral and religious forces of today. Therefore, the very good of humanity demands that her work be allowed to proceed unhindered. End quote. Pius XI from his encyclical Divini Redemptoris, 1937. If he was saying that back then, all the more today. So we've gone on for quite a while now, but I think it's been extremely good, everything that's been covered here. So with that, we'll wrap up, and thank you very much for coming on. We'll have you on again sometime for some other topic.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. Yep. Looking forward to it.
All righty.